No shouting. No warning. Just a smile, a simple question, and a moment that turned live TV into something no one could undo. What unfolded next wasn't scripted, wasn't rehearsed, and most importantly, it wasn't something anyone in that studio could take back. Subscribe to Prime Talk, hit like, and share your thoughts in the comments below. Because what you're about to hear is not just another celebrity interview. It's a rare live television moment where control slipped, roles reversed, and one of Hollywood's most unpredictable figures turned a simple conversation into something far more revealing. To understand why this moment mattered, you have to understand the people in that room. On one side sat Jim Carrey, an actor known not just for his comedy, but for his unpredictability. Over the years, he had built a reputation that went far beyond Hollywood roles. Yes, audiences remembered him for blockbuster hits and iconic characters, but in recent years, Carrey had become something else entirely, a public figure who spoke openly about philosophy, identity, and the nature of fame itself. Interviews with him were never just interviews. They were experiences. And on the other side was Joy Behar, a seasoned television host, sharp, experienced, and known for asking direct questions. As a longtime voice on The View, Behar had seen it all. Politicians, actors, controversies, nothing easily rattled her. Her style was conversational, but underneath it was precision. She knew how to guide a segment, how to keep control, and how to ask the questions audiences were already thinking. Which is exactly why this particular exchange stood out. Because in that moment, control didn't stay where it usually does. The setting itself was familiar. Bright lights, a live studio audience, the rhythm of daytime television moving forward without pause. Segments had been flowing smoothly, laughter rising and falling exactly where expected. By the time Carrey joined the table, the energy felt stable, predictable, even. But predictability is something Jim Carrey has never been known for. At first, everything appeared normal. Greetings were exchanged. Smiles were shared. The audience responded warmly, recognizing a familiar face stepping into a familiar space. There was no indication, at least not immediately, that anything unusual was about to happen. Yet, beneath that surface-level comfort, there was something else. A subtle shift in tone. Carrey's posture, his pauses, the way he listened, closely, almost analytically, before responding. It wasn't disruptive, but it was noticeable. Especially to someone like Behar, who had spent years reading guests in real time. The conversation began where many celebrity interviews do, light topics, current projects, general observations. But even in those early exchanges, there was a difference. Carrey's answers didn't follow the expected pattern. He didn't simply respond, he reframed. He expanded. He turned straightforward questions into broader reflections. For a casual viewer, it might have seemed intriguing. For a live host, it introduced something else entirely, unpredictability. And on live television, unpredictability is a risk. Because there are no edits, no second takes, no opportunity to reshape a moment once it's already happened. As the segment progressed, the questions began to shift slightly. Not dramatically, but enough to move the conversation from surface level to something more personal. This is where experienced hosts often test the boundaries, gently steering the discussion into territory that reveals more than rehearsed talking points. Joy Behar had done this countless times. But with Jim Carrey, that familiar strategy didn't lead to a familiar outcome. Instead, it opened a door that neither side seemed fully prepared for. There was a question, simple on the surface. Direct, but not unusual. The kind of question that, in most interviews, would lead to a predictable answer, maybe even a rehearsed one. But Carrey didn't answer it the way anyone expected. He paused. And in live television, a pause can say more than words. The audience felt it first. That brief moment where laughter fades, where attention sharpens. Behar noticed it too, her expression holding steady, but her focus narrowing, waiting for the response. And when it came, it didn't just answer the question. It changed the direction of the entire conversation. What followed wasn't loud. It wasn't chaotic. It was something more subtle, and in many ways, more powerful. A shift in control. A reversal of roles. The interviewer, for a moment, becoming the one being observed. Because instead of simply responding, Carrey began to challenge the premise of the question itself. Not aggressively, not disrespectfully, but deliberately. And that's when the tension began to build. The studio remained quiet, but not in a comfortable way. The kind of quiet that signals attention, not relaxation. The kind where every word matters a little more, and every pause feels a little longer. For viewers at home, it might have felt like something was happening, even if they couldn't immediately define it. For those in the studio, it was clearer. This was no longer a routine interview. This was something unfolding in real time. And the most striking part, no one could stop it, because this wasn't pre-recorded. There was no cutting away, no resetting the tone. Whatever was happening would continue, live, unfiltered, and visible to everyone watching. Joy Behar, experienced as she was, adjusted. She leaned in, listening carefully, maintaining composure. But even for someone used to navigating difficult conversations, this moment required something different. It wasn't just about asking the next question. It was about regaining control of a conversation that was slowly slipping away. And Jim Carrey seemed fully aware of that shift. Not in a confrontational way, but in a way that suggested he understood exactly what was happening and was choosing to continue. The balance of the interview had changed, and the audience could feel it. What started as a simple exchange had become something else entirely. A moment where expectations no longer applied, where the usual roles, host and guest, were no longer clearly defined. And as the conversation moved forward, one thing became clear. This wasn't just an interview anymore. It was a live television moment that would be remembered, not for what was planned, but for what wasn't. Because the next question would take everything even further. By the time that moment unfolded on live television, the groundwork had already been quietly laid through years of evolving public perception, shifting expectations, and a growing sense that Jim Carrey was no longer the same kind of guest he had once been. For decades, audiences had known him as the high-energy performer, the actor who could transform his face, voice, and entire body into something larger than life. From early sketch comedy to major Hollywood films, Carrey's identity in the public eye had been clear. He was the entertainer who delivered laughter, unpredictability, and spectacle. But over time, something changed. His interviews began to take on a different tone. Instead of simply promoting projects or sharing light-hearted stories, Carrey started speaking more openly about deeper themes: identity, purpose, the illusion of fame. He questioned the nature of celebrity itself, often turning interviews into philosophical reflections rather than promotional appearances. For some viewers, this shift was fascinating. For others, it was unexpected, sometimes even uncomfortable. And for talk show hosts, it created a unique challenge. Because traditional interview formats rely on a certain level of predictability. There's an unspoken structure. The host asks, the guest answers, and the conversation moves forward in a controlled, engaging way. But when a guest begins to challenge that structure, when answers become questions, and conversations turn inward, the dynamic changes. That's exactly the kind of environment that was forming long before Carrey sat down across from Joy Behar. As a longtime co-host of The View, Behar had built her career on navigating complex conversations. The show itself thrives on discussion, often blending entertainment with opinion, humor with directness. Guests aren't just there to promote, they're there to engage. And Behar, in particular, is known for her ability to keep conversations grounded. She listens closely, responds quickly, and isn't afraid to push for clarity when something feels unclear or incomplete. In most cases, that approach works. But with someone like Jim Carrey, the usual rules don't always apply. Leading up to the interview, there was no widely reported conflict between the two. No obvious tension, no public disagreement that would suggest a confrontation was inevitable. On paper, it was a standard booking a well-known actor appearing on a major daytime show. But context doesn't always come from conflict. Sometimes, it comes from contrast. Carrey's increasingly introspective, unconventional interview style, paired with Behar's structured, direct approach to conversation. Two very different ways of communicating, meeting in a setting that demands clarity, timing, and control. And then there's the nature of live television itself. Unlike pre-recorded interviews, where producers can edit for tone, pacing, or clarity, live broadcasts operate without a safety net. Every word, every pause, every reaction happens in real time. There's no opportunity to reshape a moment once it begins. That reality raises the stakes for everyone involved. For the host, it means staying in control, guiding the conversation, maintaining flow, and ensuring that the segment remains accessible to the audience. For the guest, it means being present, responding not just to the questions, but to the energy of the room, the reactions of the host, and the awareness that millions may be watching without interruption. And when those two roles fall out of alignment, even slightly, the result can be unpredictable. In the days and weeks surrounding the appearance, Carrey had already been giving interviews that hinted at this unpredictability. He spoke about the concept of identity as something fluid, even illusory. He questioned the idea of playing a role not just in film, but in everyday life. These weren't typical sound bites. They were layered, abstract, and often required careful listening to fully understand. For audiences used to quick, entertaining responses, this shift could feel disorienting. For a live talk show format, it introduced something more complex: timing challenges, tonal shifts, and moments where the expected rhythm of conversation no longer applied. And yet, none of that guaranteed what would happen on that particular day. Because live moments aren't just shaped by context, they are shaped by timing. A single question asked slightly differently. A pause that lasts just a second longer than usual. A response that takes the conversation in an unexpected direction. Those are the variables that can turn a routine segment into something else entirely. As the interview approached, the production environment remained standard. Producers prepared topics. The hosts reviewed talking points. The audience filled the studio, expecting a mix of entertainment and conversation. From the outside, there was no indication that this segment would stand apart. But inside that structure, the potential for something different was already present. Carrey's approach to interviews meant that he wasn't simply there to deliver expected answers. He was there to engage, on his own terms. And those terms didn't always align with the traditional flow of a daytime talk show. Behar, on the other hand, was prepared to guide the conversation, to ask questions that would resonate with viewers, and to maintain the pace that live television demands. Neither approach is inherently conflicting. But when they intersect in real time, without the ability to pause or reset, even small differences can become significant. As the segment began, those differences were subtle, almost unnoticeable. A slightly longer response here. A moment of reflection there. Nothing that would immediately signal tension, but enough to suggest that the conversation might not follow a predictable path. And then came the shift. Not a dramatic interruption. Not a sudden change in tone. Just a moment where the direction of the conversation began to move away from the expected and towards something less defined. It started with the framing of a question. Simple. Direct. In line with what viewers would expect from a show like The View. As the conversation edged closer to that turning point, the atmosphere in the studio began to shift in ways that were difficult to define, but impossible to ignore. The rhythm slowed. The pauses became more noticeable. The energy, while still controlled, felt more focused, more attentive. Joy Behar leaned in slightly, maintaining her role, guiding where she could. Jim Carrey listened, not just to the words, but to the space between them. And somewhere in that space, the balance of the interview began to change. What had started as a structured conversation was now approaching something far less predictable. And when the next exchange began, it wouldn't just continue the interview. It would redefine it. The shift didn't arrive with a raised voice or a clear break in tone. It came quietly, almost imperceptibly. At the exact moment a question was asked and an answer didn't follow the expected path, Joy Behar leaned slightly forward, her posture composed, her delivery measured. The question itself was not unusual for a setting like The View. It was direct, framed in a way that invited a clear response. Something the audience could easily follow, something that would keep the segment moving across from her. Jim Carrey listened without interruption. There was no immediate reaction. No nod, no quick reply, just stillness. For a fraction of a second, it felt like a normal pause, the kind that happens in any conversation. But then it extended, and then a little further. Just long enough for the silence to register. In a live studio, silence carries weight. The audience, which had been engaged in the rhythm of the conversation, seemed to settle into that pause, not restless, not confused, just attentive, waiting. Carrey's expression remained calm, almost reflective. His gaze didn't shift away, but it didn't lock in either. It was the kind of look that suggested he wasn't just hearing the question. He was examining it. When he finally spoke, his voice was steady. But the answer didn't land where the question had pointed. Instead of responding directly, Carrey began to unpack the premise behind what had been asked. He didn't reject the question outright. He didn't deflect. He approached it differently. He spoke about perspective, about how questions are often shaped by assumptions. Assumptions about identity, about intention, about what something is supposed to mean. His words moved outward rather than inward, expanding the conversation instead of narrowing it. For a moment, it wasn't entirely clear where the response was going. And that uncertainty created tension. Behar maintained her composure. Her expression didn't shift dramatically, But her focus sharpened. She listened closely, following the thread of what Carrey was saying, waiting for the point where it might circle back to the original question. But it didn't. Instead, Carrey continued, calmly, deliberately, speaking in a way that seemed less about answering and more about reframing. The conversation was no longer anchored to the structure of question and response. It had become something more open-ended, more abstract. And in a live broadcast, that kind of shift is difficult to manage. There's no pause button. No opportunity to redirect off-camera. Everything happens in real time, with every second carrying forward into the next. Behar stepped in, not interrupting but guiding. She adjusted the conversation, attempting to bring it back to something more defined. Her tone remained even, professional, but there was a subtle shift in pacing. A slight urgency, not in her words, but in the timing of them. She asked a follow-up, clear, focused, designed to narrow the scope. Again, Carrey paused. This time, the silence felt different, not just reflective, but intentional. The audience could feel it, that quiet awareness that something was unfolding, not dramatically, not explosively, but undeniably. When Carrey responded, his tone remained controlled. But there was a clarity now, a sense that he understood exactly where the conversation had been, and where he was choosing to take it. He spoke about roles, not just in acting, but in life. About how public figures are often expected to fit into narratives that aren't entirely their own. How interviews can sometimes become performances, structured exchanges that reinforce those narratives rather than challenge them. There was no accusation in his voice, but there was implication. And in that implication, the dynamic shifted further. Because now the conversation wasn't just about the topic at hand. It was about the conversation itself. Behar listened, her expression steady, but the balance of control had begun to move. Not abruptly, not completely, but enough to be noticeable. She attempted another redirect. A subtle pivot, bringing the focus back to something concrete, something the audience could immediately connect with. But Carrey didn't follow the pivot in the expected way. Instead, he acknowledged it, and then moved past it, not dismissively, not confrontationally, just deliberately. The rhythm of the segment slowed. What had once been a steady exchange now felt measured, almost deliberate in its pacing. Each response took its time. Each pause stretched just slightly longer than the one before. The audience remained quiet, engaged, sensing that this was no longer a typical interview. And then came the moment that defined the exchange. It wasn't a single sentence. Not a dramatic declaration. It was a shift in direction. Carrey, rather than continuing to respond, began to ask, not in a formal sense, not a direct reversal of roles, but in a way that placed the conversation back into the space of reflection. He referenced the nature of the questions themselves, the expectations behind them, and the broader context in which such interviews take place. For a brief moment, the structure of host and guest blurred. Behar responded, professionally, calmly, maintaining her role. But the dynamic had changed. The conversation was no longer being guided in a single direction. It was moving in multiple directions at once. And all of it was happening live. No edits, no cuts, no opportunity to reshape what had already been said. The cameras continued to roll. The audience continued to watch. And within that controlled environment, something unscripted had taken hold. Carrey's tone never rose. His posture remained composed. There was no outward sign of confrontation in the traditional sense. But the tension was there. The pauses, the redirections, the subtle shift from answering to reframing. Behar, drawing on years of experience, began to close the gap, guiding the conversation toward a conclusion that would restore balance. Bring the segment back within its intended structure. Her timing became more precise, her transitions more deliberate. And slowly the conversation began to return to familiar ground. But not entirely, where a simple question had led to a broader reflection. Where the roles of host and guest had even briefly overlapped. As the segment approached its end, the atmosphere remained composed, but different, more aware, more measured. The audience responded with polite applause, the kind that signals appreciation but also recognition that what they had just witnessed was not entirely typical. The cameras prepared to transition. The conversation moved toward its closing, but the tension, the subtle shift that had unfolded over those minutes lingered. Because in live television, it's not always the loudest moments that leave the strongest impressions. Sometimes it's the quiet ones, the pauses, the unexpected turns, the moments where something changes without anyone needing to say it directly. And as the segment came to an end, one thing was clear. What had just happened wouldn't simply disappear. It would carry forward. Beyond the studio, beyond the moment, into the way this exchange would be remembered. As the segment transitioned toward its closing moments, the shift in atmosphere didn't disappear. It settled. The kind of quiet awareness that follows something unexpected lingered across the studio. Joy Behar maintained her composure, her posture steady, her tone controlled as she guided the conversation back toward a familiar ending. On the surface, the structure of the view remained intact, but underneath there was a noticeable difference. The energy had changed, not dramatically, but enough for both the audience in the room and viewers at home to recognize that what they had just witnessed was not part of the usual rhythm of daytime television. Jim Carrey sat calmly, his expression unchanged from the measured tone he had carried throughout the exchange. There was no visible attempt to soften what had just occurred, no effort to reframe it into something lighter. Instead, he remained present, as if the conversation had unfolded exactly as intended. The applause that followed was polite, but not immediate. It came with a slight delay, a subtle indication that the audience was processing rather than reacting instinctively. In live television, those fractions of a second matter. They reveal when a moment lands differently than expected. As cameras began to pull back and the segment officially closed, the production moved forward as it always does. Transitions were executed, the next segment prepared, and the show continued. But the moment didn't stay confined to that brief window of airtime. It carried forward, first within the studio itself, then beyond it. For the hosts, the immediate priority was continuity. Live television doesn't allow for reflection in real time. There is always another segment, another discussion, another topic waiting to begin. And yet the residual effect of what had just happened was difficult to ignore. There was a slight recalibration in tone, a subtle return to structure, as if the conversation needed to re-establish its boundaries. For Behar, the handling of that moment was consistent with experience. She had not escalated. She had not lost control in any visible way. Instead, she had adapted, adjusting pacing, redirecting where possible, and ultimately guiding the segment to its conclusion. That ability is what defines a seasoned host. Not the absence of unexpected moments, but the ability to navigate them without disruption becoming chaos. For Carrey, the outcome was different. Not in terms of visible reaction, but in perception. What he had done was not overtly confrontational. Yet it challenged the framework of the interview itself. By stepping outside the expected pattern of response, he had shifted attention away from the topic and toward the process of questioning. That shift, while subtle, was significant, because it altered how the exchange would be interpreted after it ended. Once the broadcast concluded, the moment began its transition from live television to recorded memory. Clips circulated, analysis followed. But unlike moments defined by clear conflict or dramatic statements, this one was discussed in a different way. It was described as tense, but not explosive, uncomfortable, but not hostile. And that distinction is important, because it highlights what made the exchange stand out. It wasn't about volume. It was about control, and how easily it can shift when expectations are challenged. In the hours and days that followed, viewers revisited the segment, not to find a single defining quote, but to understand the progression, the pauses, the redirections, the gradual change in dynamic. These are the elements that gave the moment its weight. For media observers, the exchange became an example of how live interviews can evolve beyond their intended structure. When a guest refuses, calmly and deliberately, to operate within the expected framework, the host is faced with a choice: push harder or adapt. In this case, adaptation prevailed. And that decision kept the moment from escalating into something more overt. But it also allowed the underlying tension to remain visible. For Carrey, the long-term impact aligned with the public image he had already been building. His willingness to question not just topics, but the nature of discussion itself, reinforced a persona that resists simple categorization. He was no longer just participating in interviews. He was at times redefining them. For Behar, the moment served as a reminder of the challenges inherent in live broadcasting. Even with preparation, experience, and control, there are variables that cannot be predicted. And when those variables emerge, the role of the host becomes less about directing and more about managing balance. The broader cultural significance of the exchange lies in its subtlety. In an era where viral moments are often defined by conflict, volume, and clear opposition, this moment stood apart. It demonstrated that tension does not require confrontation. It can exist in pauses, in reframed questions, in the quiet shifting of roles between two people in conversation. And that is why it continues to resonate. Not because it was loud, but because it was real, unedited. Unscripted. A moment where the structure of live television held just long enough for something unexpected to pass through it. As viewers continue to engage with moments like this, they reveal something about the nature of media itself. That even in controlled environments, authenticity can surface, not always in dramatic ways, but in subtle, unplanned exchanges that challenge expectations without breaking them entirely. And for a channel like Prime Talk, these are the moments that matter, the ones that invite closer attention. the ones that reward careful listening, the ones that remind us that behind every interview there is a dynamic that can shift at any time. If you found this breakdown insightful, subscribe to Prime Talk, like this video, and share your thoughts in the comments below. Because the most powerful moments on live television aren't always the ones that make the most noise. They are the ones that change the conversation without anyone realizing it until it's already happened. And those are the moments we continue to uncover.